Hey everybody, it's Terry Jess. Wanted to share my racial autobiography with you. As somebody who cares deeply about racial justice and about dismantling systemic racism, particularly in my field as an educator, I do get asked a lot about like why do you do this work? Why do you care so much about this? What's driving you? What caused you to find your way into this work? And I think that comes from many different places. But I do wonder sometimes if people have an expectation that in order to care about this, you must be have a very close proximity to a person of color as a spouse or as a child or as a best friend or whatever it may be. I don't think that's necessary, obviously, to care deeply about this. And two, I think it betrays the notion, particularly amongst white people, that when we're talking about racism and injustice and race in general, that white people aren't included in that. That whenever we're talking about race, it's about people of color. It's not about white folks, which of course is distinctly not true. White people created race. They created racism to justify racial caste in this country. And so, being able to be a part of dismantling that should be a deep part of every white person's journey, whether they're looking to undo racism in the field that they're working in their communities, whatever they may see. But it starts with ourselves. So I want to go back as a child, I grew up in a household that was not racially conscious by any stretch of the imagination. I think in general, I received lessons about treating people good and not necessarily judging people based on the color of their skin, kind of growing up in the 90s. That was a strong message in schools. I think my parents, my mom especially, like reinforced that narrative. But I also grew up hearing a ton of racism from my father, and from myself. Like it was so permeated our culture and what we listened to and what we saw, that it was just commonplace to have those things. But I remember from a young age just feeling the inherent wrongness of that, the immorality of it, the injustice of talking about people because of the color of their skin and making assumptions about them or making conclusions based off of those things. So even though, I grew up with language like my father did use racial epithets a lot for people. And he would say that, it's not about a race because there's good white people and there's bad white people, there's good black people and there's bad black people, but he would insert pejorative racial epithet along those lines. And he also was kind of always saying, I'm not a racist, I'm a separatist. I don't believe that we belong living together. And so, I think originally I always sensed that was wrong and that it wasn't okay. I wasn't in a place as a child where I felt like I could openly challenge that or outright challenge it. But I did in my own mind, and I did as I started to learn and read about things. And so, growing up in North Idaho, there are not a lot of folks of color around. It's overwhelmingly white. And the first black student joined us in seventh grade. And, I remember having, like the feelings of, wow, like noticing difference and, like it being different of the way that he presented himself, the way that he talked, like how his culture manifested, how his background, his family history, like everything that made him who he was oftentimes just different than what we were seeing a lot of in North Idaho. And so watching that tension in our community of that, and both the exoticization of him and the racism of what people said or presumed or said outright to him was something that was the first opportunity for me to really think about it and to actually do something and I wasn't there yet. And so I didn't disrupt that. I didn't interrupt it. I was listening to hip hop music and thought that it was perfectly okay to say the N word as long as you weren't saying it in a mean way towards someone or calling somebody it. Um, and that was pretty common amongst my friends group. And so um, I think I was like, okay, I'm not a bad racist person. I don't say bad things about people. Like I heard from my dad. I didn't march in the streets like the Aryan Nation Brotherhood that was in Hayden, Idaho. Every year they would have a march of hate and spew anti-Semitic and racist things. And so I wasn't them, right? I could pat myself on the back and say like, no, I'm not them. I'm not going to be mean to people. I'm not going to think bad things about people, even though I'm starting, you're right, be socialized and internalize all those things. So I was kind of content that way. Um, as I went through high school, I became a teen parent and, had kind of a hard go of things. And so my life was about my life, right? Like what I was experiencing, what I was going through. I was disengaging from school. I was disengaging from kind of broader conversations, but I did at the time convert to Christianity. And it was interesting to see racism within the church, but it was like couched in like this pseudo Christian love, um, where a lot of stereotypes, a lot of conversations around elections and voting for Republicans, reinforced racist tropes and racist language. Of course, nobody would say a racial epithet, right? But they would still have all those things. And I felt pressured to remain silent. That you can't say anything about that, even though there were times definitely where like somebody would say something and I'd be like, that is messed up, or that's not right, or, maybe I don't really want to be around that person because of what they said. But I wasn't openly challenging things. When I decided I wanted to become a pastor, and my church sent me to Bob Jones University in South Carolina. And I remember, I must have started challenging things throughout high school and early college, particularly around, I think, is when my brother went to war in Iraq. A lot of my dad's racist language from the military came out, and I openly would challenge him about like calling people names and using racial epithets and saying things. Because I remember in 2006 when I was preparing to move to Greenville, South Carolina, to go to Bob Jones, not really knowing anything about the school, that my dad said, well, now you're going to know. You've always talked about how, like everybody's equal and that I'm racist because I say things about black people, but you're going to live in South Carolina and now you're going to see it, and we'll see if you come back, singing the same tune. Which, of course, I was sure that, yeah, I would not be coming back as a openly racist person. As I lived in Greenville, South Carolina, I was pretty sheltered with Bob Jones University. But again, seeing that how racism permeated within the church, within the church's politics, and their treatment, and seeing a university that was in a predominantly black area and yet was overwhelmingly white. And the people of color that attended most often were people who were international students who were coming into the university. So it was there that I realized that Christianity was not the path for me, but I had to keep it inside for a while. And my wife really encouraged us to leave and get away from that. But it's also when I started realizing I wanted to be an educator. And instead of that. And so when we decided to go to university, come back to Idaho and go to the University of Idaho to become an educator, I was really looking to unpack my beliefs, the way that I've been taught, the way that my behaviors were. Still not having a lot of interactions with people of color personally, but now I'm at the University of Idaho. I am learning how to be an educator. I'm reading about texts, of course, there's a lot of things that got used around like freedom writers and, I grew up and I had seen Dangerous Minds. And so I think there was this notion of like teaching in the inner cities. And, at the time I wouldn't have realized that, how coded that language was, but it was this kind of white savior trope of going in, and, teaching kids who don't have all the opportunities and have resources denied to them, what now the education, many people in education are calling those furthest from educational justice, again, trying to erase the like focus on race and isolating of race of that, people who are the products of systemic racism. And so, I started to think about that. I started to look into like multicultural education. I started to have these questions of how can I teach students that I don't know and that don't have similar experiences to me, and that where I don't understand what their lived experience is because I'm white. And so, I think I was still in a place of being non-racist, and then I wanted to, learn more and learn more. And fortunately, I had a wonderful professor who constantly was challenging the beliefs of people in the education program at the University of Idaho, to dig deeper and to do more of the work. And to really look at yourself. And so the university had brought in Tim Weiss to be a guest speaker, who is an anti-racist writer. And he came in, gave a talk about racism and about anti-racism, and really talking about how white people have a responsibility to be involved in cleaning up the mess of racism. That we need to be a part of it. And he used a quote from Angela Davis that has resonated with me every day since I heard it, which is that in a racist society, it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be anti-racist. And so that was like, oh, okay, like I need to know more. I need to do more. I need to be involved in this. So that kind of transitioned me out of my like unconsciousness or my non-racist phase into my learning phase of where I just really started trying to read as much as I could, go to as many talks as I could, get into that. I decided to, got into teaching, was student teaching in Post Falls, Idaho. Not a lot of folks of color, but getting to talk and also starting to get to see systemic disparities where students of color were disproportionately disciplined, referred, graduation rates, dropout rates, like all those things. And so really getting to see the depth of the problem in our education system and start to learn more. Started to challenge things like, as a student teacher, I wanted to start changing curriculum, right? And I remember it was a controversial because I wanted to put Columbus on trial for crimes against humanity. And the world history teacher that was supposed to be my mentor was really upset about that, about challenging that narrative, and tried to reduce the amount of time that I could spend on it, and tried to, really control like how I challenge that narrative. And so continuing to grow, I decided to focus on multicultural education for my master's degree in curriculum and instruction. And so really, I got to get into a lot of great research and a lot of great works, and learn even more, where I was really preparing myself for what I want to do. But of course, again, not my lived reality yet. Hadn't really lived with a lot of people of color around me, didn't have close relationships with people of color, and certainly hadn't really taught a large portion of students of color. And so started applying for jobs all over, right? Got hired at Bellevue High School. And, it was interesting because I was looking, if I was going to get hired in the Seattle area, I did want to work more in the city and not in a suburb. But I didn't get hired, right? Like I got hired at Bellevue. And so I start teaching, in Bellevue, and I want to challenge, I want to, do things differently. I want to, the way I teach, the curriculum that we teach, I want to challenge. And now I have a higher percentage of Black students, Latino students, and Asian students. Actually a smaller portion of Indigenous students. So there was more Indigenous students in Idaho than are at Bellevue High School. But getting to have those, and I remember going in my first year, there was a moment about halfway through the year where, I'm thinking like, okay, I've been doing a lot of learning. I'm really getting to a point where I think I'm trying to be anti-racist in myself and what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do. And my first year teaching, there was a student, young man in my class, young Black man in my class, and one of my classes, and he was talking, and I, kind of out loud challenged him to get on task, and he responded with, "You're only calling me out because I'm black." And I remember in that moment, like the discomfort, like this is the first time that like I've outright been like, assumed that I was doing something racist as a professional, and it really challenged me. And I remember I deflected in my discomfort, and I was like, that's not what this is about. And like, I just need you to do your work and things like that, and kind of moved on. And I didn't explore that. I didn't really like dig in. I didn't have that conversation with him about when he's experienced that and why he may, and like to this day, he might have been joking. He might have been, just using it to have an out. Unlikely, right? In my experience, like I think that there was something there that the way that he had been treated in Bellevue schools that surfaced that, and rather than look to repair that harm, I perpetuated and caused further harm with it. And so it really sat with me about like, okay, I'm not where I think I am, but I want to continue to learn. So I kept trying to learn. My third year of teaching, I got approached by my principal that Bellevue School District was starting equity teams, and I immediately wanted to jump in. I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to get involved and learn as much as I could. Pacific Education Group came in and started stuff, and some of it was stuff I knew, and some of it was new, right? Completely new to me. And so having courageous conversations about race, their protocol, using mindful inquiry, looking at assumptions and aspects of white culture, aspects of white supremacy, getting into critical race theory, like that was all pretty new for me in my third year of teaching. And so I'm just diving in, trying to explore it as much as possible on the equity team, really starting to look at the deep systemic injustice that is present in my school, not just systemically, right, in my school. And wanted to dive into that. Around the same time, a professor from the University of Washington reached out to our community because he had students that were doing this project pilgrimage where they were going on civil rights pilgrimages to the South and learning about the civil rights movement, and they wanted to get involved with youth and kind of like training young people on how to be activists and how to get involved and create change in their community. And so from that, we started an organization at Bellevue High School called Bending the Arc, which was dedicated to Kingian nonviolence and creating systemic change and using race as a primary lens. So between those two things, getting involved in equity and really starting to do the work systemically to try to create change in our policy and our procedures and our practice and our curriculum, as well as getting involved with students and learning more and more about what they were experiencing and about what they wanted to see change. It really just became about like, how do we absorb risk as a white person and do the work. And that's where I would say, I transitioned from really being in a place of learning before year 3 to being in a outright aspiring anti-racist activist role, and have been unapologetically pushing ahead since then. And so right away, like there were times where I had to put, like my beliefs on the line of like, do you really believe this? And I risked, like around my employment, around things, helping students organize around anthem protest, using district communication to share about Black Lives Matter at school and, that type of thing before it was accepted, and really starting to challenge, publicly our structures, not just trying to do it within the system, but sometimes having to go without the system. And so since then, I've tried to, in every aspect, tried to elevate student voice and tried to dismantle those things. And that's what I want to keep centered all the time is the student's voice and voices from communities that are being most impacted by the systemic racism that exists. Was, part of being white and white privilege is getting recognition for doing things that aren't really that great. And so not that the work that I did wasn't important and wasn't like, the students were amazing, but I got nominated for a national award based off that work. and from that was asked to start working with other educators about being anti-racist. And so for the last 5 years, I've had the privilege of working primarily with white educators about how we show up and how we do the work and the need for us to do it, and navigating that. I've got the chance to write a little bit, and get to speak on these issues. And so that's just solidified that this is what I want to do. And now, as I'm going in to be a principal, I want to see if I can maintain the anti-racist dismantling of systems from within, but also activism with people who are trying to create change on the ground, in a principal role. And to be honest, I don't know if it's possible. I'm gonna do it though. Like I'm gonna be who I am. I'm gonna continue to challenge these things. And if it's not possible to do it in the way that I think it needs to happen, then perhaps I won't be a principal for long. But I hope that's not the case. I hope people are ready for change, and I hope that I can continue to grow, continue to learn, to see how my whiteness impacts my choices, impacts my leadership, impacts the people around me, and start to, move past just these ruts that we've been in as a society, as we've been in as a school system, to really create communities that are just for everyone. So that's my story. Thanks for listening, and keep up on the work, y'all.